I'm Femi OK. Welcome to the Stream Home Edition. You may have heard there is a US election happening next month. Now, voters are being advised to have a plan, and voters with disabilities, that is not quite so easy. We asked some voters what their past experience have been trying to vote and having a disability. This is what they told us.
Many polling places aren't wheelchair accessible, so localities create separate stations where people then have to budget extra time and resources that they might not have, like a caretaker.
Voting in a regular year is a chore because, in part, the voting booths are not my size. I'm 4'6". The voting booths are for tall people, so whoever they imagine is a citizen voting, they have not imagined me.
To begin with, voting is harder for us. We either have to make sure we get an absentee ballot, we have to make sure that that ballot itself is accessible, especially for people with vision loss, and we have to make sure that our polling locations are accessible.
Actually physically driving to a polling place, standing in line for an unknown period of time, and then standing to cast my ballot is often really difficult and can render the process inaccessible. Many polling places are also not wheelchair accessible, which blocks a number of disabled voters from voting in person. Voting by mail can be a great way to circumvent those accessibility issues and ensure that people who are physically disabled with limited mobility or stamina can still have their voices heard.
So you take those challenges and then you add a global pandemic, and that even magnifies some of those challenges. We are talking about voting with a disability in the US this year and what solutions there well may be. I know you have ideas. If you're on YouTube, you know what to do. You can jump in the comment section and you too can be part of this conversation. I'm going to say hello to the guests. The guests will introduce themselves to you. Hi there, Rosie. Tell everybody who you are.
Hi, my name is Rosie BICHELL. I work with disability rights advocates based out of Berkeley, California. I'm a Justice Catalyst Fellowship attorney.
Good to have you. Rashida, welcome to the stream. Introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Rutgers Singh, and I work for AAPD, or American Association of People with Disabilities, as their voting initiative coordinator, which is Rev Up.
Nice to have you. Hello, Stephanie. Welcome to the stream. What do we need to know about you for this conversation?
Sure. My name is Stephanie ENYART, and I lead the Public Policy and Research Institute for the American Foundation for the Blind.
Stephanie, I was looking at where we are for voting across the United States. And I'm just looking up here, the Americans with Disability Act and other federal laws protecting the rights of voters with disabilities. I'm just going to scoot down a little bit. It says here, Title II of the ADA requires state and local governments to ensure that people with disabilities have a full and equal opportunity to vote. Now, the ADA is over 30 years old now. Why are we even having this conversation? Why is it still difficult to vote if you happen to have a disability?
Well, I can certainly speak from the experience of someone who has a visual disability. I've been voting using an accessible machine inside polling locations that allows me to manipulate through options, make markings on my ballot independently with complete privacy, and then print out a ballot and then put it in the ballot box with everybody else. In this context, with this election, we have the global pandemic adding a layer of difficulty. And that layer of difficulty really applies a lot to those who are non-drivers. Non-drivers maybe because of a disability, like a visual disability or blindness, or other health conditions. Or old age. And so from that standpoint, there's a lot of individuals we know that will be looking at alternatives or having to make some tough choices about maybe autonomy and privacy versus health or safety. And on that note, we can look specifically at data that shows and illustrates this problem with COVID-19. My organization actually released a report a week ago called Flatten Inaccessibility. And what that showed is that 68% of individuals are having all kinds of transportation complications during COVID-19. It also looked at voting issues and many other facets of life. So the complexities of this pandemic are really layered and complex issues for the disability community.
I'm just thinking, Rosie, the law is there. It's very, very clear, but yet you have been involved in taking legal action against the state that you're in, North Carolina, because they're not adhering to the law. What is going on that is going wrong?
Absolutely. So something that my organization and our partners have observed is that states really seem to adhere. They don't understand that federal disability law, including the ADA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, trump, for lack of a better word, state elections code due to the supremacy clause, which is a pretty fundamental piece of our Constitution. So a lot of states are reluctant to allow for accommodations that make voting more accessible for voters with disabilities because they're stuck on these state elections codes that do not account for the specific barriers that arise for folks with disabilities.
I want to bring in Robert McClure here. He's a professor of disability studies, and he kind of nails the conversation that we're having right now. Here he is.
Voting rights have long been a component of the disability movement because of inaccessible polling stations or ballots that aren't available in Braille, or simply the need for assistance when casting a vote. All of these issues are far more pronounced in a pandemic where one is actually endangering one's health or life if you have a compromised immune system or are older or have diabetes or many other conditions. All of these issues were pronounced during the primaries in Wisconsin, for example. Not allowing widespread voting by mail is actually a disability rights violation. And activists are working to draw attention to that, mainly using the hashtag cripthevote on Twitter and other social platforms.
Rashida, if we're looking at some of the campaigning, some of the lobbying that is going on right now, what can you share with us?
So this campaigning has been going on for quite some time now. This is nothing new within the disability community regarding access to increased voting and such. It has become more of an issue currently because of the situation and the circumstances and how it's become a lot harder for people with disabilities to vote, and so our campaigning has increased and has become more digital. The lobbying has gone through social media more now, and it has become online now. Disability community and disability rights organizations have united and have been churning out papers, letters, and doing events and such. So we're really trying to come together and increase our social presence, our online presence, to raise our voices against these issues.
Stephanie, I'm just thinking that normally on the stream, whenever we talk about a subject that involves people with disabilities, there are a couple of things that we do, and one of them is to have somebody who is doing American Sign Language. So that would normally be at the bottom of the screen, but we can't do it because we're all working remotely, and we just want to keep everybody safe. What else are you seeing that is different this year, where we're having to really tackle a global pandemic, as well as saying, you know, we have rights as people with disabilities, and we want to still vote?
Well, I know that we've acknowledged that there is quite a bit of litigation that's going on related to voting accessibility. And so from the standpoint of a very mixed landscape, we have very different options state to state. The state that I'm in, Virginia, we recently did get a wonderful win for the blind community to be able to receive electronic ballots that we can use computer software to complete remotely and then print them and submit them. So some states may have different rules that people need to make themselves aware of and bring into their own thinking and their own planning around how they plan to vote. I will say that the Flatten and Accessibility Curve survey that was released last week really speaks to the fact that even just in the blind and low vision community, 43% of those who completed our survey actually showed that they also have other health conditions, and those may be conditions that they're really worried about being exposed in an actual polling environment. And so I really encourage people to think about whatever their circumstances are and balance that kind of autonomy and privacy with health issues or even accessibility issues to figure out, in my home state, what options make sense for my personal circumstance. Is it that I have a new option like electronic voting, absentee? Do I have other resources at my disposal? In terms of working with someone that's a trusted, friend within your quarantine circle, that you can help complete a ballot, or is it that really truly the best option for your own submission of ballots is to go to a polling place and hope that those machines are cleaned between use because you're really manipulating something in an accessible voting machine.
Rosie, I see you nodding. Rashida, I see you nodding. Rashida, you go first.
I guess Stephanie seemed to kind of say it all. Personally, I've been lucky enough to be able to vote in the way necessary, but that is why it's more important for people in my position to raise their voices and on behalf of those who have not really been able to. And so I guess to add to that, I would just say that what the important issue that we're trying to get out right now is, like she said, to make sure that there are multiple options and multiple voting plans available to people with all types of disabilities. There is no end all be all. Sometimes, vote by mail is not accessible to certain people or not the right option. Sometimes voting in person in the polls is the right option, like Stephanie said. So, and that has to be made safe and secure for everyone. So it's about having multiple options.
Also, you would think that a mail-in vote or an absentee vote, that solves a lot of problems. The vote comes to your home, so then you can vote at home. But there is a question about privacy and who helps you, and if you should have some help. Let me bring in Sarah Blohovec. She's a civic engagement and voting rights organizer, and she brings up some of these very important points. Let's have a listen.
38.3 million people with disabilities are eligible to vote this November. Unfortunately, the coronavirus pandemic does make it more challenging as many people with disabilities are high risk. For people who have vision, mobility, or cognitive disabilities, voting by mail or absentee ballot may not be accessible if their state doesn't allow for electronic ballot delivery. In that case, they have to decide whether to go to the polling place to vote so that they can use the accessible machine or have someone mark their ballot for them, sacrificing a private and independent ballot. Disability rights organizations are working on this issue because people with disabilities should not have to choose between their safety and the privacy and independence of their vote.
Rosie, can you pick up on this idea of privacy, as I would say, because that's important. It's not just, well, someone can help you, because nobody else has to have help with their voting. That should be private between you and who you want to vote for.
Absolutely. And so this really hits the nail on the head. The right to a secret and independent ballot is a right that most Americans take for granted, but many voters with disabilities are not granted that right due to inaccessible voting platforms. And my organization and a lot of our partners are really trying to work on increasing the accessibility, meaning privacy and independence of absentee voting in a number of states for the reasons that have already been stated by the other panelists and also by the advocates who've spoken also. So for a voter, for example, a voter with a disability who lives in a state where the absentee ballot is the only option is to get a standard print absentee ballot, they need to rely on someone else to read out the choices to them, to mark their choices. They are forced to divulge their vote to someone else. They're forced to depend on that person to mark their ballot accurately, to send off their ballot accurately. This is not something that other voters without disabilities are forced to do. And so there's a sort of nationwide effort these days, advocacy effort to increase access to one example is electronic voting platforms that are accessible for screen reader assistive technology. That's something that we were able to get for November 3rd in North Carolina, and we're currently, due to a case that we filed in federal court, and we're currently working on the state and implementation to ensure that as many voters with disabilities in North Carolina who wish to access the electronic voting platform will be able to access that. But we faced a lot of reluctance on the part of the state, and their main argument was not that their program was not discriminatory against folks with disabilities. It was merely that they didn't have enough time to make sure that they could make the absentee voting program accessible by November 3rd. The judge did not buy that, neither did we, and now we're working with them to make sure that it is accessible by November 3rd.
Let me share with you a thought from YouTube. This is from NGQP. Was there something that changed this year to disenfranchised disabled voters? We would say people with disabilities. It seems like nothing changed, and this has been an issue for a very long time. Stephanie, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I mean, I agree that there have definitely been voting issues for a long time. I mean, as someone who has used an alternative method within a in-person voting for all the elections I've been part of, I know that it's been a challenge. There have been many instances where I go to a polling place and the accessible machine that I need to use is something that isn't set up properly. Maybe it malfunctions. The poll workers that happen to be there that day don't know exactly how to fix it. And so I'm in a space where I have to actually rely on a complete stranger in the polling environment to complete my ballot for me. And, you know, that is a challenge. Looking at some of the alternatives that have definitely come about in many locations like Virginia and North Carolina it's an exciting moment. Potentially these solutions could address some of this by having people use their actual personal technology to complete the ballots. You know, this isn't a universal solution because it isn't available everywhere. It's a very mixed landscape this year. But it's certainly a start in terms of looking at some alternatives to let people take it into their own hands, just as people take their own absentee ballots into their own hands in their own homes as they complete it with a pencil or a pen.
I want to bring in the voice of Nicole Schroeder. Nicole has a voting plan, and I want you to hear Nicole's voting plan. Let's have a listen.
As a disabled individual voting in the upcoming election, there are a lot of barriers to my participation. I'm worried about large crowds, long lines, and of course I'm worried about exposure to COVID-19. Luckily, I'm very privileged. I live in a small town where it's easy to participate in early voting, and allies have offered to help me get to the polls. Allies have offered to drive me to the polls. They've said they'll wait as long as necessary for crowds to die down, and they'll drive me home afterwards.
So Nicole there is utilising her allies, but Rashida, what other options could there be? There are, in the United States right now, 38 million people with disabilities who are also eligible to vote. This is not a niche conversation. This impacts millions of people. Options. What could options be?
So, first of all, it's a little difficult to navigate because of the various rules that change state by state. So the most important thing is to make sure to go to your local elections website and make sure that you know the accurate information. But the options are early voting, both early voting in person, early voting through absentee vote by mail. So right now you can already request your vote by mail ballot. You can drop it off in person, so that's early voting absentee. You can go and you can avoid the super long lines on election day by voting early in person now in certain states. And then on election day, as we just saw, you can have allies help you. There are certain companies, certain organizations that are providing rides to and from polls. You can call in and make sure that the polling places are accessible because they are required to be so. And you can call in, make sure they are safe and secure. If they are not, there are election hotlines that you can call and kind of, I guess, complain about that, and they will help you resolve the issue. Hopefully that will not be necessary. But every state also has a protection and advocacy organization within that state that you can call to make sure how to vote and what is the most right way for you to vote. They're the, I guess, local expert that you would say. There are options out there, and you have to just make sure you know which one's best for you.
Alice Wong is a friend of the stream. She is an activist for people with disabilities, and I want to share this with you from the Ford Foundation because she really emphasizes why this conversation, these efforts so that people with disabilities can vote and in private, like everybody else, why it's important. Here's Alice.
All people need to be able to exercise their right to speak out, their right to vote, their right to make their voices heard. Oftentimes, physical barriers, attitudinal barriers, and policy barriers really prevent people with disabilities to be full participants in our society. People with disabilities are still facing numerous barriers, whether it's at the polling station, whether it's filling out an absentee ballot, or whether they're even allowed to vote because there are people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and many of whom are under guardianship for various reasons.
Rosie, I'm just looking at some of the legal wins that have happened quite recently. So on my laptop, voting more inclusive for blind voters in North Carolina this November. That's one of your wins. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Blind voters in Pennsylvania win court challenge on road to fully accessible mail-in voting and receive immediate relief. So this was a little bit earlier for the primaries in June. And then one more, which was about Virginia politics, and also a win for Virginia there as well, which Stephanie told us about a little bit earlier. I am thinking, Rosie, is the law the best way to actually make sure that people with disabilities, they can vote freely the same way as everybody else? Do we have to use the stick rather than the carrot?
As a lawyer, I would like to say that the law is the best way to enforce these rights, but it would be irresponsible to rely only on courts and litigation. This really requires a multi-pronged advocacy approach. I mean, while there have been successes in courts in a number of states that you mentioned, in addition to other states like Pennsylvania and a couple of others, there still is resistance in some other courts, including in Texas currently. There's an active case where the state is still resisting a similar request from what we received in North Carolina. And so all this to say that the courts are a really powerful way to vindicate these rights, but that cannot be done in a vacuum. It requires on-the-ground advocacy, it requires education, it requires coordination amongst different advocacy groups and grassroots movements. So it's all part of a piece of a big puzzle in order to make sure that everyone's rights are protected.
Thank you, ladies, so much. Thank you, Stephanie and Rashida and Rosie as well. And Nicole. Nicole is also on YouTube. Thanks, Nicole, for being on YouTube. And Nicole ends on a "This is how technology can help us" note. Screen readers, voice to text on screen keyboards, touch screens, electronic pointing devices, they can all help with digital accessibility. But what is obvious from the conversation that we're having right now about people with disabilities trying to vote in the upcoming US election, that there's still some way to go. Thank you, guests. Thank you, YouTube, for helping us with this conversation today. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.